Welcome to Trash Compactor. I'm Josh, and this week we're presenting an episode of our cousin podcast, The Secret Origins of Mint Condition, in a discussion that I participated in back in May about the redemption, or lack thereof, of Darth Vader. This is one of the best Star Wars discussions I've ever been a part of, and it touches on a lot of topics that we've talked a lot about here on Trash Compactor, and in a lot of ways, it feels like it could be a missing episode, but it's not. It's an episode of another podcast, and I'm very jealous and proud and thankful that James has allowed us to share it here on the Trash Compactor feed. Just a quick note, this episode was recorded before the release of Obi-Wan Kenobi on Disney+, so keep that in mind as you listen, though the bulk of what I say would, I think, remain unchanged. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to James, who leads this discussion about the redemption of Darth Vader.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Secret Origins of Mint Condition. I am one of your hosts, James, and with me is Joe.
Hello, folks.
And Chris.
Hi there.
And we have a returning guest, friend of the show, and host of Trash Compactor, a Star Wars podcast, which officially launches its season 1 debut today. Josh Bernhardt is here.
Hello there.
Thank you for coming on, Josh. We really appreciate you being on, especially when we're talking all things Star Wars. So we're really excited to have you on today.
I'm excited to be here. I've been looking forward to this podcast for months, I think.
Yes, we've been teasing this for a while.
Thanks for being here, Josh. We really appreciate it.
No, I'm really, I said it twice. I'll say it again. I'm really excited to be here. I'm looking forward to this one.
Excellent. Well, so I'll give you a little history before we launch officially into the podcast, because, I would say the topic that I put forth today for this Star Wars episode would be the original podcast topic, even before I decided I wanted to do a podcast, and even before I approached Joe and Chris about doing the podcast. So I give a little back history on this. Is our topic is going to be centering around Darth Vader, and I'll get into the more specifics around it. But as Josh has said, when he first met me, he saw me wearing a Darth Vader shirt in mint condition. Darth Vader growing up, I really liked the character, and thinking about approaching this episode and the character of Darth Vader, I kind of, this is my adult version of why I thought that way, but I guess in my mind, I like Darth Vader because the last impression you ever have of something sometimes is what's left with you, and the last impression I have of Darth Vader with the original trilogy is that he kills the Emperor, returns to the good side, and ends up a Force ghost at the end of Return of the Jedi. So in my mind, all the things that we'd seen in A New Hope and Empire, I guess for my young mind, liking the character, were kind of erased because in the end, he was a good guy. So I guess that's my justification now as an adult. I can't go back in time and figure out any other way. So there could be differences in that in my younger self. But so I had that going for a while. And then the prequels come out. And the prequels, number one, is not what I thought Anakin would be as a starter, but that's a whole separate podcast, I think. And then when we get to Revenge of the Sith, Anakin Skywalker, now Darth Vader, really crosses the line and murders, as we joked about, younglings. But it's really, in the Star Wars universe, that's not a joke. He literally kills, I think, at least 10 to 20 young Jedis, if not more. I don't even know if we know the count, but he kills a whole bunch of young children in his efforts to fulfill his role as Darth Vader and be the Emperor's right hand. So all of that, and the prequels, we could, again, a whole other podcast topic about what the prequels are. The prequels kind of I wouldn't say ruined Star Wars for me, but I took a break from Star Wars for a long time. But as Disney started re-promoting Star Wars and I was into the expanded trilogy, I got back into it and I started rethinking my thoughts about the character Darth Vader. Obviously, it's one whole saga, so episodes 1 through 3 to 4 through 6 all count. So my liking this character as I grew up changed into this is a really bad guy. I mean, what we saw on screen him do in Revenge of the Sith and everything else. And if you're a person like me who reads the in-canon Marvel comics and stuff that Marvel started to do once they acquired it, he's done terrible things, hunted down and killed rebels and Jedis and that. So my real question for this episode, and Chris and I talked about this. This was Chris has mentioned in previous podcasts. This was the topic that rekindled our friendship after 16 years.
It spanned multiple phone conversations. Yes, it did.
Yes, this was a long philosophical topic, and I've discussed this with Josh as well many times. So this is the podcast to finally have our thoughts out. And Joe, I have not discussed this podcast topic with you, but I'm really interested in your thoughts. So the conversation is at the end of Return of the Jedi. Anakin Skywalker appears as a Force ghost, which kind of implies to you that all is forgiven with the Force, I guess, because he's there with Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda. And if you watch Clone Wars and Rebels, you know Qui-Gon is not there in the scene, but he's also attained that. So it means like to be a Force ghost, you've attained a certain amount of enlightenment and balance or whatever peace with the Force. And it seems like all is forgiven. So I have to ask, and Joe, since I have not talked about this with you, I'll have you go first. Does is Anakin Skywalker slash Darth Vader worthy of that redemption at the end of Return of the Jedi?
I'm still wrestling with this, James. I know this is going to be the question, and I've been thinking about it and thinking about it. And maybe by the end of this podcast, I might be able to answer that question in an affirmative one way or the other. But right now, I would have to say I'm leaning towards no,
That's
because of all the things you just enumerated. But that said, he's when you talk about cinema villains, when you talk about the greatest villains in cinema history, of course, Darth Vader is one of them. I mean, he's right up there with Hannibal Lecter, Nurse Ratched, Mrs. Danvers from Rebecca, which an incredible villainess, Michael Corleone. So and there, and some of them we talk about, especially Corleone. Is he a bad guy? Is he a good guy? Does he redeem himself at the end? But he loses everything. He loses his family, but he kills all his enemies. So this is a great question you have posed, and I'm going to sit back for a bit and listen to the other answers from you and Josh and Chris, and maybe you'll push me in the other direction. Maybe you won't. But
Okay.
that's where I stand right now. I'm straddling a line right now.
I like this, Joe. I like
Like another great villain, and Chris will appreciate this. I hope I get this right. The vacillating Richard. Was that Richard the Second, or Richard the Third, Chris?
Ooh, I honestly couldn't tell you offhand.
But that's the premise of that play, is because you can never make up his mind. So they're constantly vacillating. So I am a Shakespearean character at this point right now, wrestling with this answer.
Well,
That said, I appreciate that you have now put it into my head that I desperately need to see a version of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with Vader in it, as well as a version of A New Hope with Nurse Ratched in it. So thank you for putting that in my head, Joe.
Nurse Ratched she's scum and villainy.
well, Joe, I appreciate you being I like the audience that has like a kind of be swayed in this argument. So, but Josh, since you are a guest, let me turn it over to you now. What are your thoughts on what I've proposed?
I have so many thoughts. But to stick with this question, my thought process is actually almost beat for beat the same as Joe's. I struggle with this a lot as well, but I ultimately come down on the side of he's not redeemed, at least in my eyes. I do think the films are saying, I think the authorial intent is to say he is redeemed. But I don't know that I buy that. And, it is interesting because I think it's ironic. You said that seeing the Anakin Skywalker of the prequels actually made Vader less redeemable or more irredeemable, as the case may be, when ironically I think the intent was the opposite. I think George Lucas's expectation was, through seeing who he was as a young man and the good man that he was, you would be more apt to accept his redemption or know that he has good in him, when ironically, as you point out, seeing him murder a bunch of kids, a room full of helpless kids in episode 3, is kind of what, for you, and I would say probably for me as well, is kind of beyond the pale. I think that, and slaughtering the tribe of Tuscans in episode 2, who I actually, by the way, I have made a point not to refer to them as Sand People or Tuscan Raiders, since seeing their more rounded depiction in the Book of Boba Fett, where it's really framed as like they are the native inhabitants of Tatooine. So to call them raiders is kind of unfair, because
Mhm.
any raiding that's going on is because of all of these colonizers who have shown up on their planet and set up shop, and they're just like, what are you doing? But I digress. So yeah, I don't think that Vader is redeemed just because he does one final act of good where he decides to do the right thing. And there's also a way that you can look at what he does in a very selfish way, because now that we have the prequels, basically what he does when he intervenes when the Emperor is killing his son, he's basically, with the context of the prequels, flashing back to his failure to save Padme's life. And he's basically, what must be going through his mind is, wait a minute, I've been here before. I have an opportunity to save somebody I love, so I'm going to take it. So it's kind of, selfish in a sense. I don't know that he's acting so much out of, wait a minute, the Emperor's evil and I have a chance to do the right thing once and for all. I think there's a way to read it where he's doing it selfishly, where the whole catalyst or the final straw, depending on how you look at it, for his fall to the dark side was his attachment to his loved ones and his inability to let go, wanting to possess them. And ultimately, the idea of not being with Padme or being without Padme, makes him crazy and makes him willing to turn to the dark side and do whatever Palpatine says, and just, on a dime, slaughter his best friend and a room full of kids. And, I think he realizes, wait a second, I don't want the Emperor to murder my son. I love my son. um, and, whether or not that is, I mean, which I certainly think is the right thing to do. But hard to see what his motives are. I don't know that you can definitively say that they're so clear cut. It seems to me it's yet another act of selfishness, potentially. And the one final thing I will say on this, in an upcoming episode of Trash Compactor, a Star Wars podcast, we have a long conversation about Return of the Jedi, where we do discuss very briefly. We kind of have a mini version of this discussion at the end. And we kind of landed on something similar. And then my friend John, who's a frequent guest on Trash Compactor, who was not on that episode, he heard the discussion and he pointed out that in his mind, Vader's soul is what's redeemed there, not so much whether or not he should be forgiven by the people around him or, the galaxy. He really made the distinction that in that moment, Vader redeems his soul, or he redeems his soul in the eyes of the Force, whatever that means, which I think is an interesting idea. And I think is certainly what is there in the text. I think that's the intent. I think it is a very Christian notion about souls and forgiveness and all of that. But one interesting distinction, though, that I want to make, that occurred to me, was, first of all, I'm Jewish. I'm not very much practicing, but some of the values in the Jewish faith that separate it from, Christian values is really embodied, I think, in the observance of Yom Kippur, which is the New Year's ceremony, when we ask forgiveness for our sins, the things that we did wrong, the mistakes that we made in the previous year in preparation for a clean slate for the upcoming New Year. And one of the things that you do in Yom Kippur is you need to ask forgiveness from the people you have wronged before you can ask forgiveness of God, right? So you basically have to settle up with the real people who bore the brunt of your mistakes or your sins or what have you, before God or the universe or whatever can forgive you, before you can even ask for that forgiveness. And so I think that, approaching this question of, does Darth Vader redeem himself at the end of Return of the Jedi, it's kind of a cop out, but I think it depends on your point of view. I think it depends on where you're coming from. I mean, if you believe that, your redemption, the tally is between, like, your soul and the universe, then sure, okay. Maybe in the eyes of the Force or God or the universe, all it takes is one final change of heart, and you're good to go. Um, if you take a more kind of humanist material view of goodness and redemption. Vader, while that's a good start to have a change of heart at the end, he will never be able to do right by the people that he wronged, by the galaxy that he wronged. He will never be able to make up in the material world for all the pain and death and destruction that he caused. So, I think it's an open question. I think it depends on where you're coming from, and in a way, he got off easy because he died. He's lucky he died, because he didn't have to face those, the reckoning. The rest of his life would have had to have been devoted to making up for or apologizing for the destruction that he's responsible for, and who's to say that he would have been willing or able to stick with that? I mean, after years
Yeah.
and years of trying to do the right thing and, constantly being challenged or told it's not enough, who's to say he wouldn't just go right back to the dark side, which, as we all know, is quicker, easier, more seductive to get what you want.
No, those are so many good points, Josh.
Yeah, they are. Great points,
I-
Josh.
just to kind of, I mean, I guess I just to elaborate on your last point, but what I want before I throw it to Chris is like, I guess if he had survived, though, he would have, I mean, he arguably would be put on trial and possibly executed if the rebellion believed in that kind of justice. But, um,
Well, well, Josh, the way he put it very eloquently, it reminds me of like the 10-step program in Alcoholics Anonymous or drug program, and you have to forgive the people you've wronged before you can forgive
Mm.
quote unquote maker. Before maker will forgive you. So you have to make right with the people you've harmed physically and psychologically. And that, again, that's on a personal level. Yeah, you might find that forgiveness, but it doesn't mean it wipes out what you've done. Yeah, I'm still struggling, guys. I'm still struggling. So, but you've made me think about some things, Josh. So go ahead, Chris. I'm just wanted to let just wanted to get that out there.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you've both brought up really, really good points, and I know James has some more. For me, whether or not Vader is redeemed by the end of Jedi totally depends on the scale of the discussion. And the reason I say that is because I agree with Josh 100% that the authorial intent is that Vader is redeemed. That's why he shows up at the end. He's now on, like, once he's turned back to the light side, that's how he dies and that's how he stays. So I definitely think that was the intent. I do think that if we just look at just the original trilogy, episodes 4 through 6, I do think Vader is redeemed. I say that because we talk about there's all sorts of talk about what he did, but we don't entirely know what he did, right?
Right.
We know that he apparently killed Anakin. That said, we also learn that he is Anakin, so it's true from a certain point of view. So how much of the evil that we've heard Vader has done is actually evil versus the mythology spun around this creature of myth who is Vader? So I think that when you look at it strictly from episodes 4 through 6, I think Vader can be redeemed. Yes, he is part of trying to crush the rebellion. Yes, he has every intention of killing Obi-Wan Kenobi, but in those contexts, in those specific contexts, he's not the one who built or used the Death Star. Obi-Wan allowed himself to be struck down by Vader. There are a number of ways in which we saw Vader torture Han and Leia, and that's, I obviously that's a bad thing. But then he's the reason the Emperor dies. He kills the Emperor as far as we know, right? So I think episodes 4 through 6, he is redeemed. I think when you zoom out though, and you start incorporating other elements of his story, I think that's when it gets, I wouldn't even say it gets murkier, because I don't think it does get murkier. I don't think he finds redemption. I don't think he can be redeemed for what he's done. I think we see that once he kills everybody that he kills in the first three movies, episodes 1 through 3, really episodes 2 through 3 with the Tusken Raiders and with Mace and with the younglings. Um, so I think he hits a point of not being able to be redeemed there on that scale. And also I don't think the storytelling was very good from episodes 1 through 3. So not only am I disinclined to believe that Vader is redeemable, but also I don't like Anakin as a character. So it's not even like I care whether or not he is redeemed. And I don't know how much that plays into, and I've got a couple of other things, but really quickly, I want to put the question to the three of you. how much does your opinion of Anakin, based on just episodes 1 through 3, how much of that does plays into whether or not you think Anakin is redeemable? Is whether or not I mean, do you even want to see him redeemed based on the character that we've been introduced to in episodes 1 through 3?
Well, that is a complex
Good
question.
question.
If we're only taking episodes 1 through 3 into consideration, I don't really care enough about the character Anakin, and he's not my favorite at that point. Like, I'm actually at that point rooting for him to become Darth Vader because it's a lot more interesting once he's in the suit.
Yeah, see, that to me is really interesting. Joe,
Yeah.
Josh, what do you guys think?
Oh boy, I don't know. That's a tough one. That's a tough one, Chris. But the way you framed it, though, if you're just looking at the middle trilogy, and we don't know his horrific background, then yeah, maybe he's redeemable. But once we learn these things that he did in the past, yeah, I mean, no, he's not. Again, you can ask for forgiveness. You can ask for those of your loved ones and friends and even your maker, but doesn't mean you're going to get it. And so no, I don't. I'm starting to, not waver as much, and I don't think he's not. I don't think he's redeemable.
Well, and whether I mean, here, even without the middle 3 movies, whether or not you're rooting for a character, I think
Yeah,
makes it relevant. I mean, Josh, what do you think with your storytelling experience and your movie consumption experience?
Well, I'm going to answer your question sideways.
Yeah, by all means.
sounds like me.
Here's one thing I can't quite get over when it comes to Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader. In a lot of ways, it's very hard to see the through line the way he's depicted in these 6 movies, because he's a composite character.
Right.
He's never portrayed by the same that his so in episode 1 he's portrayed by one actor who only portrays him in that one movie, and then he's played by a completely different actor who's a completely different age in the next movie. So at least for me, I'm not there's a disconnect for me in my head and my recognition of the continuity of that character. Like in my mind, it's very hard for me to see the young boy who we see in that first movie, episode 1, as the same character as Anakin Skywalker in episode 2, which, so if you're doing the math, if you're playing along at home, 1/3 of the character's arc in the prequel trilogy for me is completely gone, because I have a hard time seeing that as a part of the journey of this one character. Then you have one actor who portrays him for 2 movies, and those 2 movies are arguably the only time that we are seeing this fully formed conception of the Anakin Skywalker character, where he evolved to this conception of the character, right? Then once you get to episode 4, to Star Wars: A New Hope, he's played by 2 actors, well, really 3 actors if you count Bob Anderson, the stuntman, and that the idea that he was Anakin Skywalker wasn't even there when they were making the movie.
Right.
So it's literally not intended to be the same character when it was made. Retroactively, it kind of works and you can kind of paper it over. But the point stands that it is literally not the same character. So you're now 2/3 of the way into the story of this character. He's been portrayed by 3 different actors, 4 different actors if you count the voice separately. And where we're at this point, he's not even supposed to be that same character. And by the time you actually see him with his mask off, by the end of episode 6, that's yet another
Another
actor
actor, right?
who you don't associate, you don't see in your mind, oh, like that's the same guy who I last saw in episode 3 on the volcano planet Mustafar after battling with Obi-Wan. So my point is that a lot of this arc is really an intellectual exercise, and you don't feel it from the movie. You're not brought along this journey with the character, excuse me, in the movies themselves. You are told these things, and you can resolve them to see that continuity, but it's an intellectual exercise. It's not something the movies have, given you. So in that sense, I would have to say then, to answer your question, I would say I'm more willing to entertain the possibility of redemption if we're just including the original trilogy, because I think it's more straightforward a journey. And again, as you pointed out, we don't see these horrible things that Vader did when he was younger. And actually, Chris, you bring up a really good point. The things that we hear about him in the original trilogy, now we have that seed of doubt that we learn that he didn't literally kill Anakin Skywalker. It's sort of playing fast and loose with the truth. So that kind of calls into question, okay, like what else about this guy are we just kind of making assumptions about based on what we're told? I think there's enough like gray area there that you can kind of squint and not look too close and you can kind of buy it. I still think you could make a case that Vader hasn't done anything to really deserve full redemption. But once you introduce the prequels, I just think the whole thing is just so much more muddled. And I don't mean complicated, I
Right.
mean muddled, that I would have to say that I'm less inclined to give Vader slash Anakin the benefit of the doubt when you take the prequels into consideration.
Right. And that's
Right.
where I'm gonna close out sort of where I was at, because there's one more time that I sort of want to zoom out before I'm done sort of sharing, where I think where I am on Vader. And that's because if I zoom out one more time, right? For me personally, and I know there are other ways to look at Vader, but if I zoom out one more time and I take into account the Clone Wars, the cartoon series, now it's a different beast again. Um,
Yes, Chris, I'm glad you brought that up. I was
yeah,
gonna say, like as much as like that, Josh, you said the prequels were meant for us to like Anakin. I did dislike them more, but the Clone Wars actually that actually made me like Anakin.
and that's exactly what I was gonna say is I like Anakin in the cartoon series, and we see more of him being a great pilot, and he's not just cocky. We see him growing, and that's something we don't really get in the movies. We don't get to see him grow in the movies, which is one of the reasons I don't really like him. One could make the argument that he does, but I don't see any growth in him. And then specifically, I want to sort of draw everybody's attention to season 3, episodes 15 through 17. They take place on this planet called Mortis, and basically, you have Obi-Wan, Anakin, and Ahsoka are sort of abducted to this planet where we meet the ones, the father, the daughter, and the son. And the father strikes a balance between the daughter, who is of the light side, and the son, who's of the dark side, and strikes a balance there. And all three of them are trapped on this planet to retain balance in the Force. And it gets upset while they're there. And in the that all of that happening and all the happenings, Anakin is made aware of his future. He becomes aware of what he will become, and he is so distraught by what this is that he is lured to the dark side in the hopes of avoiding it. And that is temporary, because when the father removes those memories, he says, "My son broke the laws of time. That is not meant to happen," and makes Anakin forget. Anakin sort of returns to the light side. But the Clone Wars, those 3 episodes, I think, do a really great job of fleshing out Anakin and his personal struggles. But the Clone Wars series in general really gets us to a point where we're going, the Jedi don't know what they're doing, and they're dabbling in things they really shouldn't be dabbling in, and they only really see the trap until they're in it. So, excuse me, with that context, I still don't think that, Vader is redeemable, but now he's more relatable. And because he's more relatable, the idea of him being redeemed later doesn't necessarily bother me as much. But my final point is sort of in relation to that season 3, episodes 15 through 17 on Mortis, which is that ultimately, I he what is the redemption that we see at the end, right? Because Josh mentioned earlier that it's a very Christian take on redemption and the afterlife, life after death. And I agree with that, because redemption generally means something good. That said, the Force doesn't actually care about good or bad; it cares about balance. And so I think, from the Force's perspective, so much in so as it has one, um, Vader is in that moment. Anakin is redeemed, and the reason he's redeemed is not because he suddenly did a good thing and turned back to the light side, but because he finally managed to bring balance to the Force through saving Luke and evidently killing the Emperor. And so he is finally fulfilled the prophecy. Everything is finally in balance, and so I think that, in terms of, if we want to look at it that way, I think he is redeemed, but not because he did a good thing, but because he did the thing he was meant to do. So I think it's a very complex, interesting question. But it just depends on the scope.
N- I agree. I agree with the points you made, Chris, about that. I mean, I that yes, audience, if you have Disney Plus and can get the Clone Wars, I recommend those episodes as well that Chris pointed out because I thought that's
I
also
guess
a
we
big.
probably should have said spoilers ahead, right?
Yeah, well,
Yeah, definitely.
Little bit.
well, but I mean, still the rest of the series is worth watching. But if you haven't seen those episodes, there's a lot of nuance that happens in those 3 episodes that I think is still worth watching, even though you know the outcome that we've summarized here. But yeah, it's a scope thing. But before I go further, my points, Joe, you've had your hand up for a while. What were your thoughts?
Well, Josh, that's what I like about these podcasts is these revelations are always coming forth. And Josh, your what you spoke about so beautifully and eloquently was a revelation to me. I never thought of Vader in The New Hope as being that character without subtext and without nuance because it wasn't thought of the character that way. The prequels weren't even, they weren't. Maybe they were in the back of Lucas's mind, but yeah, Vader's just the guy in the black hat in the first movie in The New Hope,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
And later on, because of the prequels, Vader is basically stitched together like the Frankenstein monster, so to speak, and that's why maybe it is difficult to relate to him. So yeah, that's you blew my mind, Josh, with that, and thank you.
No, well, so
Well,
Joe, you actually invoked Michael Corleone, which I
Yes.
think is of all the villains that you mentioned, I think the Michael Corleone example is the closest analog to
Mhm.
who the prequels were trying to make Anakin into. It was supposed to be a Michael Corleone thing where, he starts off good and then we see through the course of especially that first film, we follow him through this journey. We see all the choices he makes. We understand why he's making these choices until all of a sudden we realize, oh shit, he's the bad guy now. Like he's fallen someplace. And you can do that when, setting the writing aside for a second, you can do that when you have the actor who you're relating to. Your Pacino is really bringing you along for the character of this man.
Oh yes.
And I mean, it's really amazing. Like you feel like you're seeing what's behind his eyes and you're really kind of filling in the inner life that this character has. Whereas with the prequels, you don't really get the opportunity to do that. Like the illusion that cinema is able to create when it works is this illusion of interiority, is this illusion of continuity, is this illusion of of closeness with a character who doesn't actually exist. And it's so easy to break the spell of that illusion. And I think that Anakin in the prequels and in the first 6 movies in general just has so many things working against it working that, again, I think it's really an intellectual exercise, like this whole fall and redemption of this character, because it never really connects emotionally for so many technical reasons that you can argue until you're blue in the face that those things shouldn't matter, but they do.
No, they do. You're right.
Yeah.
In the Godfather reference, just made the Michael Corleone reference. At the beginning, during the wedding, Constanzia's wedding, he tells Kate, "That's my family, Kate. That's not
It's
me."
not me.
Yeah,
Right.
we want right then and there.
Yeah.
There's a journey ahead. What's the others of those lines? He
Right.
was so college at the beginning, right?
Yep.
And then we see his rise to power and his fall as a human being. Yeah.
If you're gonna do a tragic fall, it needs to stick. You need to stick
Mhm.
landing on
Yeah.
a tragic fall because if you don't, it's just tragic. Like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
you've got to see the fall of the hero in order for the hero turning into villain is a very compelling storyline, but only if you stick the story and I think what was meant to be a tragic fall to the dark side, the prequels just utterly demolish any possibility of that.
And it's also really interesting because I've been reevaluating what happens in Attack of the Clones in episode 2, really in the aftermath of the book of Boba Fett and how the Tuscans are portrayed. Because arguably, he turns to the dark side in episode 2. He slaughters an entire village
Yep.
of men, women, and children,
Yep.
and he
does.
brags about it. I mean, he doesn't brag about it, but
He's
he
certainly
like,
righteous about it.
yeah. And he's like, look at what I did. And Padme's reaction to hearing that is kind of inexplicable and inhuman. The only way that everyone's reactions and the film's reactions, the way the film handles it, makes sense is if you accept that the Tuscans are something less than human, or I guess human is the wrong word, but like less than sentient, that on
Mm.
some level they are literally savages or whatever you want to call them. And that reading is incompatible with the way they're depicted in the Book of Boba Fett, and actually also in the Mandalorian. I think just learning that they are able to be reasoned with and you can communicate with them. We get that first in, I think, season 1 of Mandalorian.
Mhm.
It kind of makes you reevaluate the whole thing. So, I mean, it's kind of weird because, if you accept that, which I think is the correct quote unquote reading, because I'm not really comfortable with the idea that is given in the first 6 films that the Tuscans are literally savages and it's a fictional universe, so that's just what they are. Like even then, I think that that's an uncomfortable reading. So it rings more true to me that they're more multifaceted and they're not quote unquote savage, mindless animals, as Anakin says in episode 2. It's sort of strange, like the way Attack of the Clones wants us to read that is, it's like, it's okay. I know he murdered men, women, and children, but they were only savages. So like there's some wiggle room there. And that's like kind of weird because by any measure, that's when he falls to the dark side.
Right. Which I
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with that. Well, one, before I elaborate on a larger point that I know is going to open more discussion, I just want to say both for Chris and Josh, you're taking into account just the episodes 4 through 6 and how we don't really know what Vader really how dark he is and stuff. It just the analogy came to my head. Well, I guess Vader's kind of like the Dread Pirate Roberts then. We don't really know what he did,
Sure.
but
Sure.
to get to this like the bigger point, like Josh on I think on that episode you let me preview of Return of the Jedi, you had mentioned in the text that George Lucas's idea of the dark side is that once you're down that path, you're down that path. Is that correct in his interpretation of the Force?
Yeah, so this was something that was kind of a late revelation to me. I didn't understand this when I was a kid, and this is only something that I only learned from reading J.W. Rinsler's Making of Revenge of the Sith, which came out not long after the movie came out. So we're talking about like 2005. And they're talking about the reshoots that they did to put some more meat on the bones of Anakin's fall and kind of retool the movie a little bit. Because originally, basically, the way the dark side works is the more evil things you do, the more times you give in to greed and you give in to your anger. There's sort of like there's like a force meter, right? And so every time you do that, you give into your anger or you do something evil, you tick a little further over into the red, a little further over into the dark side, until finally you do one thing that makes you cross the threshold, and then it's like flipping a switch. All of a sudden you're on the dark side and you're consumed with hate and anger and evil and all this, and then like you're a bad guy. And if you accept that version, those mechanics of how the Force works, then all the movies make sense. The way that, Vader and the Emperor are trying to make Luke fall to the dark side, they are trying to goad him into giving into his anger, and they're trying to goad him into attacking so that his force meter will cross over the dark side line and then he'll be bad. And if you accept that, then Vader doing one last heroic act, one good thing would hypothetically be enough to put him back into the light side territory. The only problem with that is dramatically on screen that doesn't really work because, if you look at episode 3, the episode 3 that we got, even then, a lot of people said that Anakin's fall, his turn, his acceptance of being on the dark side and becoming Vader is like, it's sort of like a very quick heel turn. It seems very sudden and unexpected. And that's because what they were trying to soften was an even more, abrupt heel turn that they apparently, once they saw the first cut of the movie, they realized wasn't really working because you don't understand why he's all of a sudden doing that. So then they retooled the movie to really make his motivations more clear. They really focused it to be more about he's scared about losing Padme, and the only way he can see to save her is through learning this forbidden knowledge that Palpatine has, and that's sort of the carrot that he uses to convince him to follow him, and that the Jedi are bad. So
And
so
see, this is
it does kind of soften it a little bit, but that issue is still there.
because the problem is I think they tried to invent a new thing they didn't when they didn't need to invent a new thing. I think what they needed to do was because ultimately they showed us a lot of big battles, and they showed us what was happening on the scale of the Galactic Republic, right? They were showing us so much of a big scale. They were showing us because we had to find out what happened with the droids and what happened with Yoda and what happened with Obi-Wan, and so they were trying to tell us too many stories at once. You know, when you look at something, a story like, say, Macbeth, every time there's like a war or a big battle, it happens off screen. It happens off stage. You don't see any of these things happening. And the reason you don't see them happening, in my opinion, is because they need to stay focused on Shakespeare as a writer. And our attention as the audience, our focus has to stay on Macbeth. We need to be able to see what's happening with him and with Lady Macbeth in order to understand why he falls in the first damn place, right? We need to be able to see the arc of his character. And so that's why so much of the action happens behind closed doors with him, with his wife, um, as opposed to, hey, we're going to show you a really big battle now that's going to last for, I don't know, 20 pages of the script, even 10 pages of the script, right? And so I think that, in my opinion, that was part of the problem, is that, as ridiculous as it probably sounds to some of our listeners, I think they didn't spend enough time on Anakin because they ended up with no room for nuance. And without that room for nuance, I think you get what we got.
Right. And also, I would say it's probably, again, we could discuss this on and on, but the writing and the handling of the character acting wise didn't give way to a lot of nuance that probably could have been there. And I'm not playing anything against Hayden Christensen because, like he's working with the script. And as, we've said that George Lucas was looking for less emotion in his actors. So that was kind of, doing, maybe he couldn't give the nuanced emotion of Anakin checking these boxes to fall to the dark side. But I will also say, so that description of how you turn to the dark side almost, is sort of a form of possession, and not like you do things obviously, but then once you've done them, you're in the dark side, which is like the dark side's possessing you, which is sort of like I don't like the description because it kind of takes away that it's not solely Anakin's fault. He did these bad things,
It
but he's
removes
also now
agency.
it removes agency, which I don't like.
Exactly. It kind of gets you off the hook.
Yeah, so with that in mind, yeah, I guess he could be redeemed because he finally did a good act and he's overall a good person. But I don't know if I like that as a ticker thing because, like I said, takes away agency, takes away free will, and I thought the Force is kind of like, and how you wield the Force is sort of like it's based upon the Jedi or Sith who's wielding it and their personality and intention.
Well, and now the question becomes, okay, so what's the threshold? Because Luke uses the dark side in Return of the Jedi at the very beginning when he force chokes the Gamorrean pig guards, and they haven't attacked him. They didn't do anything. Oh, they're a threat to him, but they didn't actually do anything. But he very callously and casually just force chokes them. So what exactly is the threshold target?
Well, in my head canon, I choose to believe that he didn't actually kill them. He just kind of closes their airways and they just kind of passed out. I mean, that's neither here nor there.
No. I mean, and it's true. He didn't kill them. He didn't take a life. But I that's what I mean is I don't know exactly where the threshold is because technically, because he is using, and I know there are arguments that, okay, we're talking about gray force powers as opposed to dark or light. Um, but it's where's the threshold? Can you use it so many times before you turn over, or does it have to do with how many people you kill, or whether or not you kill them in anger? Because Luke kills some TIE pilots and some Imperials. He blows up an AT-AT walker on Hoth, like,
And the
I
sail
just
barge and everyone on it.
and the sail barge.
But not
And the Death Star.
and the Death Star.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm not, my argument is not that, it's this flawed storytelling, and so it doesn't make sense. That wouldn't be my argument because I think it can make sense depending on how it was intended. I just think that, some of the places that we found ourselves, Josh, I can't remember where it is that you said this, but for anybody who doesn't listen to Trash Compactor, you really should, because there's some really, really good, interesting conversations on there. And it's going to cover
Oh,
a
thanks,
lot of
buddy.
stuff you've thought about before, but from angles you didn't anticipate. So it's good, but I can't remember But you mentioned at some point in answer to somebody said something about the quote ideal watching order, and you said no, Lucas meant for them to be watched 1 through 6 straight through,
Yeah,
and
he did.
and that
I mean, or he
really,
does. Yeah.
it's odd because it really undermines the power of the Revelation and Empire, and maybe we only feel that way because because of when we grew up, those were the only movies we had, whatever. Um, but I think that a lot of the parts of the storytelling here undermine other parts, and I think that was the ultimate problem I had with the prequels, is that there were parts of that storytelling that undermined the storytelling done in the original trilogy. I know that one of the things that always bothered me about the sequels was this idea of being able to jump to or from planets. As much as I enjoy Rogue One, they managed to jump to hyperspace from the planet side, which they shouldn't be able to do because the gravity well stops hyperspace jumps. And that's what the interdictor technology is based on. Interdictors pull you out of hyperspace by creating a gravity well. It's none of it's real, but if you set the rules, I need to understand exactly why it is you're breaking them and how. And that's I feel the same with stories and storytelling is, are you undermining yourself? And I think that's what we run into here because, then you could have four fools such as us sitting around and arguing whether or not Vader is actually redeemed when that doesn't, again, the author's intent here, as you mentioned, Josh, is that he is redeemed. So you didn't intend for us to debate it, but that's what we're doing because I think your storytelling undermined your own story.
You bring up a really interesting point, actually, in terms of the watching order. I think similar to how when you haven't seen the prequels and you're just talking about episodes 4 to 6, you kind of accept Vader's redemption. I think similarly, if you watch 4 to 6 and then 1 to 3, I think it also still kind of works for a similar reason because you've seen the redemption and then you see the fall, so you don't then have to be confronted with the redemption again, having seen the fall,
Mm.
right? So,
It
so,
doesn't
so if
necessarily invalidate it because you can't go back to how you felt.
exactly,
That's interesting.
which I think tracks with the thought process of the creator who made them, right? So he did the redemption first before really, like, you can imagine if he made 1 through 3, he would have maybe depicted the redemption in a different way or made the redemption a little more complicated because he would have had to wrestle with, hey, I showed this guy murder a room full of kids a couple movies ago.
I should probably
um
do something about that.
how do I feel about that? So
Yeah.
so once again, like, I know I keep saying this, but this whole arc is an intellectual exercise that only works if you impose this outside logic on it.
Well, I mean, I think my feelings about like watching the prequels and obviously in the context of our discussion, it seems like Lucas was like, I really got to show that he's bad. So let's do these things that are
Bad.
way out of proportion. Well, I wouldn't say way out of
Unquestionably,
proportion.
yes.
Yeah, the way out of proportion for what you want this character to be. Like slaughtering Tuscans, murdering children, and everything else he's done in the prequels is like way out of proportion for the level of redemption that at least we're talking about here.
Well, I just want to say you keep blowing my mind. And this goes back to a little bit what you said a few minutes ago. We were talking about the heel turn. So I was thinking about this and how that could work. And so maybe what we should be talking about, and we are talking about villainy, but the Force in Star Wars. What is that? So what you just jogged into my head or just blew my mind was the Force is temptation. The Force is everything. And because it's temptation, you can't have a villain without choice. Villains make poor choices. And then when you tie it all together with what you were talking about earlier about the Judeo-Christian overtones in this film, well, then free will enters into it, right? So
Right.
I'm thinking right now that it's Vader made the choice because it was out there that everything is out there to be had, i.e., the Force, and he makes the choice to do these villainous acts, and therefore, okay, I'm going to put my vote in now. He's not redeemable because he's made the choice to do the things he's done. But I'm starting to look at the Force differently now through this discussion that we've been having, and
Joe, I'm so glad you brought up the Force and the nature of the Force because that kind of led to me back to something that Chris brought up, and I kind of want to see like thoughts on this. If we, and I know like I mean, I think we could all say, like, if we only take episodes 4 through 6 as like the story, then this all makes sense. But like, obviously, this is written into a larger canon, so I'm going to dip my toe now into the sequels and say that if we take the sequels into mind, and that the Force is the thing that's this judging Vader's soul redeemed by his actions, is he redeemed? Because the Emperor doesn't get killed, and he's still around by episode 9.
Yeah, I think you have to, however you come down on the redemption question of Vader, I don't think that you can really factor in what happens with the prequels, because I would say by episode 7, I think the Force is done with Anakin, right? I think that what the Emperor was doing, and he even says it in Rise of Skywalker. The reprise of his line in episode 3, the dark side is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural. I think this is not the will of the Force, whatever that means. But to have the Emperor still be alive, I think is counter to the will of the Force. And I think, that was a last gasp of Palpatine trying to pull a fast one and cheat, which the Sith seem want to do. But yeah, I do take your point, though. I think a lot of this really does hinge on the nature of the Force and how the Force works before we can really definitively answer this question. And unfortunately, this is something that George Lucas was intending to get more explicit about in his sequel trilogy, which, I mean, your mileage may vary in terms of your enjoyment or your judgment of quality for the prequels and also for the sequels we got. Um, I would have liked to have seen George Lucas's version of the sequels, not because I hate the sequels that we got, but just because I kind of wish he had had the opportunity to finish the thought. And I think he would have come down definitively on some of these questions and given us more to chew on in terms of what the intention was and how the Force worked. I know that, demystifying the Force, I think in the eyes of many fans, was one of the biggest flaws, quote unquote, of the prequels. But that said, I would have liked to have seen him follow through on the train of thought that he started in The Phantom Menace by introducing the midichlorians. He did an interview with James Cameron a couple years ago where he talked about the sequels were going to get into like the midichlorians and like how they are the wills and we are really, vessels for carrying out their will, and they kind of create the Force through their interaction with us or whatever it is. And then this idea that, I mean, as I'm saying it, it sounds very kooky, but I would have loved to have seen
Well, the
what
whole thing is cookie.
yeah, no, but like I would have loved to have seen the totality of the tapestry he was weaving. And I think that it's hard to factor in the sequels with these questions because, again, whatever you think of George Lucas, whatever you think of the unfiltered George Lucas Star Wars that we got with the prequels, there was a consistency of logic and vision even when he reversed course or changed his own mind. Like there was still, it's still all the point of view, the thesis of one mind. And I would have liked to have seen the resolution of that.
No,
And I think I'm very off topic now. I don't even know what I'm talking about.
no,
Man,
it's good.
can
No,
I
I
it's
think
fair.
can I join that club then?
And I,
Yeah,
no,
of course.
I can hear where you're coming from because I think, for anybody who hasn't seen The Good Place, it's fantastic. If you haven't watched it,
Yes.
you really should. But the premise of it, well, spoiler-ish, but the premise of it is that these people are in the good place after they've died. Um, except it turns out one person doesn't belong. She does not belong in the good place. They screwed up. And all I could think as I was watching it, I was enjoying it for the first, I don't know, say half of the first season. And then I started thinking, okay, but at some point, like they're gonna figure out you don't deserve this reward. You don't belong here. So like, you've written yourselves into a corner. How are you gonna fix it? And they do. Remarkably, they take care of it in a great way at the end of the first season. And then it happens at the end of every season where like I'm going, okay, you're writing yourselves into a corner again. How are you going to resolve it? Is this going to be the time you disappoint me? And they never ever do. There's always a way they write themselves out of it. So it certainly is possible that whatever he was going to write for the sequels would have, I don't want to use the word redeem, maybe it's too big, but would have redeemed all of the choices he made previously. And I would have gone, okay, I didn't love it, but I get what you were doing. So sure, it's not an incomplete story with the context. Contextually, I'm sold. Um, so that's definitely a possibility. But I also have to hit an age where usually if I'm about 100 pages into a book and I still don't like it, I don't finish it anymore. I quit on it. Like you said, mileage may vary.
Okay, my train is completely going off the rails here. I mean, this is a great discussion.
You're
So
welcome.
now I'm thinking, okay, the force is neutral. You leave your impressions on it. You make of it what you will. It's like sunlight. It gives you life, but if you doctor evil, it becomes a weapon of death.
Oh, I like that.
So
Very, very nice.
so I just this I'm loving this. This is great. Let's go
Well,
on into the night with this.
Joe and Chris, before Josh, I know you wanted to elaborate, but I will just say, and Josh, I apologize because you're not going to be familiar with this reference, but to Joe and Chris, the Force almost sounds like the Speed Force in many,
Yes.
many
Well,
ways.
well, James, the wormhole aliens. The wormhole aliens.
Well, the wormhole
DS9.
is, yeah, Josh, yeah. The Force seems like wormhole aliens. Like
You
you can
see, when you
encounter beings and stuff in there.
But that's also it's one of those things where it's not actually neutral, right? Like we've seen, at least again, depending on what the scope is, because if you're looking at it from the focus of from the perspective of the Clone Wars cartoon, it's not that it is neutral, it's that it has an agenda. It does have an agenda, and the agenda may veer towards balance, but that doesn't necessarily mean the balance of good and evil. Like it might be over a course of totality. So I hesitate to say that the force is neutral because I don't think it is. I think it just has its own agenda.
But Chris, isn't balance the way of the universe, the yin and the yang? I mean, isn't that so? Can't that be conceived or considered neutral because it's just the way of things?
But it's a human imposed balance. So when we talk about neutral, the human imposed balance of neutral is sort of like good and evil, right? Because that's why I say, like, I think in the eyes of the Force, Vader, maybe Anakin, is redeemed because he has now served his purpose. He's written his part of the story as the Force wanted it to be, maybe. But the reason he can't really be redeemed in my eyes is because he didn't do a good thing that canceled out bad things he did. He saved his son, and that's great, except that doesn't undo all the bad that he did that wouldn't have been necessary to save his son in the first place if he had only just not killed Mace Windu and had gotten rid of the Emperor. So, well, at that time, Chancellor. So, I would argue that because and this is where we get into, okay, but how much stoicism are we really going to get into here? That's
Yeah.
like, when we're talking about neutral, this is sort of, when God does an unfair thing and we say that's not fair, and we have to be reminded that life isn't fair.
Mm.
So is neutral really a balance between good and evil? Is it an overall balance of the universe? Is there somewhere across the universe, is there a galaxy that's suffering and they're imbalance, they're out of balance because we're out of balance too good. So now we need to be made worse so they can balance out. Like it again, for me, it really just depends on scope and perspective of the story. And that's why I say I have a difficult time saying that the Force is neutral because, we talk about the Force having tenets that are almost, I don't want to say that are difficult or impossible to reconcile, but when you're if you're a light side user, if you're a Jedi, you're not supposed to have these earthly attachments. Yet Obi-Wan, who we acknowledge to be a Jedi Master, and even if we didn't, even if we go, man, he got promoted kind of quick, he's a Jedi Knight. He says he loved Anakin like a brother, but Obi-Wan never flirted with the dark side. So is he actually a good Jedi? Is he actually a bad Jedi, and that's why Anakin fell?
Well, that's interesting because I do think there's a distinction to be made between the will of the Force, whatever that is, and what the Jedi do.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely accurate because they're acting the Jedi are acting in a different interest, I think.
Well, it's sort of if you want to use the analogy of the Force is God and the Jedi are whatever organized religion, whatever like codified belief structure that's sort of the interface between the unknowable and the material world. When you get that sort of organization, that, middle man, as it were, you get all of the, follies and foibles of human affairs, right? So you get the downsides of a bureaucratic institution and groupthink and the inertia of the way things are done, and precepts and traditions and rules are installed, and then over time you forget what the intention behind the rule was, and it becomes about the adherence to the rule because it's a rule, and less, you lose why that was a rule in the first place. And I think that that's what you get with the Jedi. And I think that that's the intention there in the prequels. Though, again, I think it's a little bit muddled because I think George Lucas loved his creation so much that he didn't really have the heart to make them not, at the end of the day, heroes. He wants to give the Jedi sort of the benefit of the doubt and give them that escape hatch so that they don't get too much stink directly on them.
I just wanted to like add to your point, like as Chris and I have added, if you watch the Clone Wars, though, I think they do a lot more nuanced in their latter seasons
Yeah, but that's later. But that's what I'm saying. Like
yeah.
that's like a retcon, right? So
That's
what
true.
I'm
Yeah.
It
so
was
what I'm
totally,
saying
it was totally a retcon.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that I don't know how much of that was there when he was making the prequel films. I think when he sees what he did and he has an opportunity to collaborate, especially when he's collaborating with other creative voices who have their own thoughts and it's sort of a give and take. And again, I say this all the time. Like, I don't think retcon is a dirty word. I know that it kind of is. Like, one of the fun things about sequels or prequels or expanded universe material, one of the great things, the fun things that I like about them is the ability to recontextualize what
Yeah.
you've already seen. Like, that's cool and fun, and when it's done well, it can be really great. So I'm not somebody who says, oh, well, that they obviously never had that in their heads when they were making this or they were making that or when they wrote that. I'm not a stickler for textual originalism or whatever you want to call it. Like, I don't really care about that. My only thing is I think you can look to the authorial intent to get clues to try and understand what you're meant to come away with, and then you can kind of evaluate that on your own. Like, okay, well, do I buy that, or do I think that that this actually works more if you read it like this instead?
Josh?
Yes.
Yeah, I agree with that because I mean, at the beginning, Lucas was obviously painting in broad strokes, right? We
Yes,
could say.
for sure.
So he wasn't Sirab employing pointillism to,
Right. Yeah.
exactly. So, right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so what I'm seeing here is, the way I keep I'm jotting down notes like crazy here, guys. Um, you know, it makes me think about the Force again and how, because he's painting such broad strokes, as he gets further down the narrative tail, he has to bring all these disparate parts together and make it work in the prequels. So, Chris, earlier I said the Force is neutral, but if it's not neutral, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but maybe the Force is just sheer will. And once again, it's what you bring to it that sets you down the path you take. So, Luke on Dagobah, right? You bring with you only what you take. You find it only what you bring with you.
Don't
when you
take
go
the gun, Luke. Don't take it. Why does
Right.
it do that? Sorry.
So, again, this all goes back to James's original question, and this is trying to get back on the path here, being meandering around like crazy. But yeah, I think he's not. I'm going to say it again. He's not redeemable because he chose this path. There was this power out there that was there to be had. The Force, whether it's neutral, whether it's will, whatever the hell it is, it's a tool to be employed, and people constantly, since the dawn of history, have used tools to make their way and put their stamp on the world. And Vader took this path, and he took this tool, and he ran with it, and he used it in an ill-advised way, or an evil way. That's not even sugarcoated.
And it's funny the way that you say that, because this is a conversation that Josh and I had about Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker. One of our biggest problems was that, Ben Solo, Kylo Ren, was offered not one, but two opportunities for redemption.
Mhm.
One in Force Awakens by Han, and one in Last Jedi by Rey. And he turns them both down. He decides he's going to be the source of power in the universe. And so that's it. That's all the shots you get. So when
Yeah.
someone did that in Rise of Skywalker, even though that was one of my many complaints, it was a very central one because it was this idea of, okay, well, sometimes you make mistakes, and we see that it's one of the things I love about Avatar: The Last Airbender is we see a character who makes mistakes, and there's still room for redemption, but Kylo Ren is past that point. I feel the same way about Anakin and Vader is like, no, at some point you make your bed and you gotta lie in it. They're just
Yeah.
redemption. We still expect you to do the right thing when it comes along, but doing the right thing isn't going to get you anywhere. It's one of my central problems with Christianity is this notion of, and obviously a conversation for another time, but this notion of do good on earth so you'll be rewarded in heaven. Okay, but then is it really good? Like, this is where we get into what is altruism actually. So, if you're doing the thing just for the reward, did you actually do a good thing? And different story for a different day. But yeah.
Here's where we can
Saying that
plug.
salary doesn't fix the lamp.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
I mean,
I'll
and
say.
Chris, Chris, with what you just said, we could also plug The Good Place again, because that's exactly what The Good Place talks about. Is
Yeah,
what you
yeah.
just extrapolate on. But I do want to like wrap up kind of with like a point that in my mind, just to kind of go upon, and Chris, you just touched upon, and Joe, you touched upon, like if you're going by this lens, and Josh, you mentioned it too, that this is written sort of with, I guess, a Christian sort of maybe mindset, then I am okay that maybe killing the emperor and saving your son is this first step into redemption. But I think, and obviously this is not what the sequels are about, and it wasn't even touched upon the expanded universe, but I would say that Darth Vader would be in a sort of forced purgatory
Oh,
until he
yes,
found,
James.
I guess, like soul wise, had
Dude,
made up for.
Yeah.
how cool would a sequel trilogy have been if we had the ghost of Anakin Skywalker, like, trying to intervene in galactic affairs so that he could get his redemption?
Mm,
Yeah, I think that'd be. I mean, that's like would be the that would make the Jedi. That would make the whole 6 episodes more palpable for me. Like I would see, like, if he's, like you said, if he's influencing how galactic politics are going, if he's sort of guiding along the next generation of Jedi to rebuild the thing he tore. That's what I would be looking from, I guess, from my background.
Yeah.
mhm.
But the will of the Force,
So,
as we
yeah.
just had a discussion about, may be different. And but that's like that would be satisfying to me in terms of a redemption story arc.
You know what's interesting? We keep talking about the will of the Force, and again, maybe it's defined a little more in Clone Wars, and obviously, I think George Lucas had his own ideas that would have worked their way into his sequel trilogy that I'm sure would have comported with whatever was laid out in the Clone Wars. But setting all of that aside, because I don't know exactly what that conception was, but you talk about the will of the Force, you talk about wanting a balance, and whether that means explicitly good and evil, or like some kind of a balance that manifests as good or evil the way that we define it. But like, what if the Force is like the tide, right? It's like a force of nature, literally, and it goes in and it goes out and it comes in, right? And the real secret is to just ride the wave. You can try to fight what the Force is doing, but when you do that, you will inadvertently cause a lot of suffering in the material world, because this is a force of nature. This is where the galaxy or where the world is going. You can't fight that, but you can sort of turn into the spin, right? Chris, you said something before about how the balance is something we are imposing on the Force. I don't know about that. I think we're imposing morality on the Force, and that made me think of like this analogy of the tide going in and out. Whatever the Force is, it's just kind of doing what it's doing. And I think if you think of it as a force of nature, and all of like the invocations of good and evil and all like the value judgments, I think that is what we are imposing on the Force. And again, it's also tricky because, this is something fictional. It's a fictional world. So there is an element of human imposed morality and intentionality, because it literally is created by the mind of a human being. So it may have that intentionality and that morality sort of baked into it. I mean, I don't know.
That's a good. I like that. But maybe the Force is just mere reflection then,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't we get this deep. This is great. I love it.
No, this is
No,
where I
no,
wanted.
yeah,
This
I'm getting a headache.
conversation to go.
Yeah, me too.
Um,
Yeah.
well, I'm gonna. I don't know if you guys would be up for it, but as a sequel to this podcast, I'm gonna propose a future podcast down the road where maybe we could talk about our own ideas of what Vader's journey or Anakin's journey would be like.
Oh,
If
that's
we
interesting.
as a because we're all creatives in this podcast, and I think we've explored a lot of different things here, and I think a further exploration of maybe how his journey in the prequels could have gone differently to make it all make sense would be an interesting exercise for the future. So if you guys are up for that, for coming
Oh
back to
yeah.
this topic.
No, absolutely.
Sure.
Though,
Yeah, I don't know
I
that it won't be. I mean, I can't promise it won't be hot
I do.
garbage, but I'll come
I
up
would
with
love.
something.
Oh, that's
Oh yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe
Pontification is my middle name.
yes.
So yeah.
I would love to
that-
join for that. I would love to join for that discussion, but the cheeky side of me is really tempted to just mail you all a DVD box set of The Godfather 1 and 2.
my two favorite movies of all time.
Well, I mean, and to go like to kind of like button it up, I agree. That's probably the best like fall from grace storyline. I will also say like as Chris and Chris pointed out, and like the Force Awakens and the Last Jedi, Kylo Ren's story is a pretty like good fall story that could have been Darth Vader's as well if done that
Mhm.
way as well.
Well, what I thought they were going with Kylo Ren, I thought that they were doing the like, there's no wiggle room here. Like he is choosing, as Chris pointed out, he gets a chance to come back once, he gets a second chance to come
Mhm.
back. And he doubles down, then triples down on the evil. And whereas you can say that Anakin went down the dark path for good, quote, reasons, he was well intentioned, and you can see it's like love, it's fear of loss, it's all this stuff. With Kylo Ren, they were sort of saying, no, he's knowing he wants to be bad, he's choosing to be bad.
Right.
He's choosing
Right.
it again and again. There's no coming back from this. Like your destiny is in your hands. He is
Not
choosing
everybody
to
gets
do this.
redeemed.
No.
Yeah.
No.
And one of the frustrating for me things about Rise of Skywalker is that's not where they ended up taking the character, is not what I thought they were setting up.
Right. I agree with that. I mean,
I would
again,
too.
we there's a whole other conversation either on this podcast or maybe in the future, Josh, in your podcast about the sequels and their intention and love of that. But yes, I agree that talking about being disjointed and multiple hands in the soup of a narrative, like the sequels are all of that. So I thought, I guess to wrap this up and to kind of give our thoughts, Joe. So where do you sit with the initial question?
All right. Well, after this intelligent professorial discussion, this lecture, this no, he's not redeemable. He's he made he did make his bed, Chris. He has to lie to it now, and I'm not on the fence anymore. He's irredeemable.
All right, Josh, do you have a solid opinion at this point?
You know what? Fuck it. He's redeemed.
Oh, Josh,
You want
wow.
to? He said he wanted to. He
That's a
said
good turn.
Oh, let me explain. Well, let
Go
me
ahead. No,
explain.
no.
Because frankly, like at the end of the day, it's really up to you whether you want to forgive somebody and call me a softy or whatever. But I think as long as you are saying the right things or appear to be doing the right things in the right direction, I will allow you to move in the direction of becoming the person you want to be now moving forward. I think the word redeemed is kind of loaded. Like the implication there is so all is erased and everything is all good. I wouldn't go that far. So if that's your definition of redeemed, no. But I would like to think, at the end of the day, same way it's Anakin's choice, the same way it's Kylo Ren's choice to do evil. If you have it within you to give this man who has done horrible things some grace, and you can not forget what he did, but sort of allow him or, help facilitate him choosing to do good and recant, then I would like to think that I would choose to do that.
All right, Josh,
Okay.
that's very fair.
That's very fair.
Chris, what's your way on?
No, irredeemable. It's, no, I mean, it's one of those things where he does the right thing at the end, but not necessarily. We don't know if it's for the right reasons or not. For all we know, it was some misguided. I want my genes to live on, so fuck it. Luke lives and the Emperor dies. There's any number of reasons, but at the end of the day, I agree with Josh. I think redemption is a very loaded word. But I don't you know, I think that it's interesting in the context of the story, but since I do tend to look at Star Wars as a whole, given the context of everything, I don't see it as a moment of redemption. I see it as the dying gasp of somebody who finally finds their way to the surface for a breath of air before they die. That's my opinion.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Mm,
No, that's a good point.
That is a good point.
excellent, Chris.
I mean,
My
again, I
final,
think it's really tricky because he dies.
yeah,
So he doesn't have the chance to reckon, the world doesn't have the chance to reckon with what he wrought. And he has no chance to do anything else. So this is all we got.
right,
Like,
and it's one of those things where you said it yourself that because he and we don't know if he's intentionally taking the easy way out or not. This could just as easily have been a suicide by cop situation, right? Like, so who knows? Maybe he started to for all we know, the horror of what he had done began to unfold in front of him, and he just decided, nope, can't deal with it. I'm going down with the ship. There's any number of reasons. So since we don't have that, again, I think, for me, it's all in the framework. But since I tend to look at it from the greater scale of here's the other material that's out there, excuse me, I say he is not redeemed. Thumbs down.
all right. So I'm going to, if we're going like strictly by the storytelling that we have, I'm gonna go he is not redeemed. However, I do allow for, and as I said, like Josh's interpretation, if it's a first step on a path to redemption, I am for he's not redeemed, but he's taking a first step into something down the road that he has to work towards, would be my final judgment. But if I had to go based upon the canon, I do not think he's redeemed. But I same as you, Josh. I would leave the door open if it's a gateway to redemption down the road.
yeah, I agree. So I would amend my fuck it, he's redeemed to not redeemed ellipsis yet? Question mark.
Yes, yes, yes. Which again, a very compelling sequel is the ghost of Anakin Skywalker trying to redeem himself.
The other thing that I'll say too, though, is that
Hmm.
I don't need him to be redeemed anymore.
Same. Yeah. Same.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah,
think that's
agree
why
with that.
I'm okay with sort of like condemning him to irredeemable too, is because I don't need him redeemed. Sometimes we end up with stories, and sometimes we have like storylines that we might see in sports. Whether somebody's won a championship or not after all these years of not quite making the cut, whatever the storyline may be. There are times when I want to see redemption, and then there are other times where I don't. Very end of Harry Potter, not the movies but the books, Harry makes it clear to Voldemort that he could, if he feels some remorse, he can come back from where he is. Nobody was interested in him feeling remorse for that. Nobody was interested in the redemption of Voldemort. What mattered was he tried. He offered the path to redemption, knowing full well he wouldn't take it. And I think ultimately that's why for me, it doesn't matter whether he's redeemed or not. I don't need to see him redeemed because ultimately it wasn't about whether or not Vader is saved. It's about whether or not Luke makes the choice to offer him the path. And Luke does, right? So I think that's why, like, for me, it's all very academic and it's all very interesting. And part of, for audience members, part of where this, the other part of where this conversation sprung up out of in the first place is that, so many of us either did like Vader or currently like Vader as a really cool character, right? And it can be hard to reconcile that sometimes, knowing what he has done. Like, how do you justify liking a villain who has done these things? It helps that he's make believe, right? This
Mhm.
isn't idolizing somebody in the real world who did these horrible things, and it's so hard to reconcile. Like you look at you look at characters or characters. You're talking about people in real life who really who sort of have that like larger larger than life that presence. And for example, I was recently reading about Joe Paterno, you know, the coach at Penn State, and how he was bigger than life and he defined Penn State. And to learn that he oversaw Jerry Sandusky, and that was not the only instance of continued sexual abuse happening under his watch. It was really hard for people to cope with that because it really clashed with their values, but also who they viewed as a hero.
Right.
So it's different with someone like Vader because he's made up. He didn't actually kill children, right? So I do think it's possible to still enjoy Vader, even if he's not necessarily redeemed. It is possible to have our minds changed as to whether or not we still like him or if he still holds that place of value for us. So it's not always just about the redemption of him in the story, but redemption of him in our own personal zeitgeist of characters we enjoyed and influences we found, I think.
Fiction needs
Yeah.
villains. Whether it be
Yeah.
narrative, whether movies, TV, whatever. You need villains. I mean, otherwise you don't have conflict. So
And you just gave me a thought, actually, Chris and Joe. Um, Sorry to just drop this in there, but maybe one of the reasons why we accept the redemption a little more when you're just speaking in terms of episodes 4 to 6 is that Vader's fall and quote unquote redemption was less about redeeming Anakin Skywalker and was really more about informing Luke's story, about
Yes.
showing
Yeah.
that there was
Yes.
a counterexample of what could happen, and also helping not only Luke but also the audience realize this lesson of we all have the capability for good and for evil within us, and it's up to us to choose which. And by showing that Vader, the black hat of the story of this galaxy, the biggest villain there was, to show that even he had a spark of light still left in him,
Yep.
that
Yeah.
shows that not only are transformations possible, but that even the good guys have that spark of evil, of the darkness within them, and that good and evil is not something that's inborn. It's not something that you are. It's that every day you have to choose to do good.
Yep.
You have to work hard not to do bad. Like you need to, it's not like one thing you wake up, you decide one day, okay, I'm this. Which is another reason why I don't want to get into this whole thing, but one of the reasons why Luke in The Last Jedi resonates with me is that it shows that to be a hero is hard and it's constant work. You constantly have to work hard to do the right thing. It's not something automatic. You have to work at it, and we can falter and we can question ourselves when we fail to live up to that like hero mantle. And so I think in the context of the original trilogy, one of the reasons why Vader's redemption works, you go with it, is because it's not about Anakin, it's not about Vader, it's about Luke.
Right.
That's
Right.
that's
100% agree.
yeah. Well, I think this is exactly the episode I thought it would be and what we would get into. So I'm so happy that that everyone could be here for it and that it went the way it went.
Yeah,
So
it was a nice tight 96 minutes.
yeah.
That was a blast.
Real tight. It was good.
In lieu of our normal recommendations, I'm going to recommend the trash compactor for us. And
Oh, that's
Josh,
nice.
would you take a moment and just plug everything about it, and what you would want people to looking forward to in this first
Yes,
season?
please.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thanks so much, James. I really appreciate this opportunity to come on and talk Star Wars and to plug Trash Compactor, a Star Wars podcast, which I do have to say, James, you're the reason that I embarked on this podcast, because when you decided to do this show, it really inspired me to get off my own ass and to do something that I've been thinking about doing for a long time. So thanks for that. But Trash Compactor is really, one of the things that I enjoy most about Star Wars in this age of Star Wars everywhere all the time is talking about Star Wars with my friends, and a podcast is a really great way to do that. I love conversations like this, and I hope that if you enjoyed this conversation, you'll give Trash Compactor a shot. Chris and James are guests on one of the first episodes, and Joe is a guest on a really great episode that we
That was a lot of
recorded.
fun.
Yeah, about Star Wars versus Star Trek, which
I'm really excited to hear that one.
no, it was great. It was great, Joe. Like I really, really loved that discussion. I
I
can't wait
enjoyed
for
the
people
hell
to
out
hear
of it.
that.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to hearing it again. Yeah.
So trashcompod.com, and we're trashcompod on all social media, and you can search for Trash Compactor on your podcast platform of choice and it should come up. And we have some good stuff coming up for the next 13 weeks of season
Cool.
1.
Oh, that's great.
Exciting
And,
stuff, man. Exciting
exciting
stuff.
stuff.
Mhm.
And Josh, let me just say that I'm very happy I could be an influence or an inspiration for our cousin podcast, as we've called it, Trash Compactor, and that And then it's quickly become, I'm glad I can inspire something that I've said to you offline, is that it's become quickly my favorite podcast thing to listen to. Because you've been kind enough to share the early cuts, or the early editions of the podcast before they drop. So I'm very happy for you, and I look forward to all the success that Trash Compactor will have.
I'm humbled that you would say that. I'm very happy that it seems to be resonating with its intended audience.
Absolutely. So once again, Josh, thank you for being here. You will be back again. And in case you guys don't know, Josh also is on the reaction show for Picard and Star Trek on this podcast network. So you can listen to him a lot this week.
Yeah, not his first rodeo.
This is
Not his
will be
first
this
rodeo.
episode. Yeah, this episode, the launch of his podcast, and I think this week, because we're recording this in advance, is also the wrap up episode of Picard season 2.
geez.
So
Oh
Josh
my
can be
God.
seen.
I'm
and
sorry,
heard.
everybody.
Very big
I'm
plate, Josh.
It's like
I'm
Shark
sorry,
Week with
everybody.
Josh.
Yeah. I'm so sorry, everyone. I don't mean to subject you to my stylings this much.
I know you're being humble, but everything that you say is very insightful and stuff. I mean, you've blown Joe's mind many times on this episode. So
Definitely did, man.
Stop.
I'm really
appreciate
excited
it.
for when Joe, James, and I go on vacation and Josh takes over the podcast for a
That's
bit.
right.
There you go.
Yeah, I know how to work a register. You can leave me minding the store, and
This is what
I'll
I'm saying.
be mostly assured everything will be where you left it.
The store will still be here when we get back.
Put the toys
so-
back in the toy
I
box.
assure you we are open.
Yes. So Josh, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Joe, always thank you for being here with your insight, and I especially appreciate your insight coming into this fresh for today's discussion. So thank you.
This is great, James. Thanks. And thanks, Josh.
And Chris, as always, thank you for being the impetus for this original conversation and leading basically this talk to the podcast that we are now in. So thank you so much.
That has been my great honor.
Thanks again, Chris.
And thank you all for listening to this episode. If you've enjoyed everything you've heard, or have thoughts and comments of your own about what we discussed today, you can leave comments on the Facebook group, Secret Origins of Mint Condition. If you want to email us your thoughts that we could share or discuss, secretoriginsmc@gmail.com. We thank you as always for listening, and we will talk to you next time.